Haunted Ohio, Vol.1, Chapter 3. It is very beautiful over there. Mr. Edison calls up the dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. T.S. Eliot. Mr. Edison's apparitions, or Mr. Edison's apparatus. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. He created the modern world with his inventions. Phonograph, incandescent light, moving pictures. The list extends to over 1,300 patents. It was Thomas Alva Edison, born at Malin in 1847. But he was not God, and he could not return from the grave. Or could he? First and foremost a scientist, Edison had little interest in matters taken on faith. He belonged to no church, and was scornful of his wife's religious interests. What he wanted was proof. I have never seen the slightest scientific proof of the religious theories of heaven and hell, of future life for individuals, or of a personal God. I work on certain lines that might be called, perhaps, mechanical. If there is really any soul, I have found no evidence of it in my investigations. But I have found repeated evidence of mind. I do not believe in the God of the theologians, but that there is a supreme intelligence, I do not doubt. Edison had a unique theory about several after death. Edison had a unique theory about survival after death. He suggested that our bodies are composed of myriads and myriads of infinitesimally small individuals, each in itself a unit of life, and that these units work in squads, or swarms, as I prefer to call them, and that these infinitesimally small units live forever. These units are so small that they can pass through solid matter, yet they still contain individual memories and skills, all that makes a living personality. Edison believed these swarms survived rather than a soul. The units of life which compose an individual's memory hold together after that individual's death. Perhaps these memory swarms could retain the powers they formerly possessed, and thus retain what we call the individual's personality after dissolution of the body. If so, then that individual's memory or personality ought to be able to function as before. Edison corresponded with the English physicist Sir William Crookes, who developed the vacuum tube which Edison transformed into the light bulb. Crookes was deeply involved in spiritualism, and had even photographed spirits. Edison figured that if spirit entities could be recorded on a photographic plate with emulsions, then perhaps they could communicate through a highly sensitive instrument or apparatus. Even his choice of words is clinical rather than mystical. Edison thought that he could build such an apparatus. He told author and psychic researcher Hamlin Garland, "And along my way I've come upon hints of these mysterious forces, and sometime I am going to stop commercial inventing and follow out these leadings." In 1920 he announced, "I have been at work for some time building an apparatus to see if it is possible for personalities which have left this earth to communicate with us. I am engaged in the construction of one such apparatus now, and I hope to be able to finish it before very many months pass." Always blunt, he displayed considerable impatience with the tilting table and raps and Ouija boards and mediums and other crude methods now purported to be the only means of communications, and declared, "The methods and apparatus commonly used are just a lot of unscientific nonsense. I didn't and don't say that all these so-called mediums are simply fakers scheming to fool the public and line their own pockets. Some of them may be sincere enough. They may really have gotten themselves into such a state of mind that they imagine they are communicating with spirits. In truth, it is the crudeness of the present methods that makes me doubt the authenticity of purported communications with deceased persons. Why should personalities in another existence waste their time working on a little triangular piece of wood over a board with certain lettering on it? Why should such personalities play pranks with a table? The whole business seems so childish to me that I frankly cannot give it my serious consideration. What Edison had in mind was an apparatus which operated like a valve. He linked it to a modern powerhouse where a man with 1/8 horsepower could turn a valve which started a 50,000 horsepower steam turbine. The device would be so sensitive that the slightest effort which it intercepts will be magnified many times, making it as valuable to the psychic researcher, he believed, as the microscope is to the scientist. Edison thought that this apparatus would be understood by those who, in this life, had been engineers or electricians. Edison's partner on this project had recently died, and Edison said of him, "In that he knew exactly what I am after in this work, I believe he ought to be the first to use it if he is able to do so. Of course, don't forget that I am making no claims for the survival of personality. I am not promising communication with those who have passed out of this life. I merely state that I am giving the psychic investigators an apparatus which may help them in their work, just as optical experts have given the microscope to the medical world. And if this apparatus fails to reveal anything of exceptional interest, I am afraid that I shall have lost all faith in the survival of personality." Inevitably, Edison's research was parodied by the media. French journalists wrote stories of Edison's telegraph office to the world beyond, where the bereaved waited in line to have their messages rapped out to the dead. Our cartoon showed St. Peter at a switchboard saying, "Sorry, that number's busy." But Edison saw his work as a search for truth. In a 1920 interview, he told the journalist, "If the apparatus I am now constructing should provide a channel for the inflow of knowledge from the unknown world, a form of existence different from that of this life, we may be brought an important step nearer to the fountainhead of all knowledge, nearer the intelligence which directs us all." Edison died in 1931. Norman Vincent Peale and many others believed that Edison saw the land beyond on his deathbed. Miss Thomas A. Edison told me that when her husband was dying, it was evident that he wanted very much to speak. Bending low, the physician distinctly heard the great scientist say, "It is very beautiful over there," comments Peale. Edison never reported as fact something he did not believe or see. He was not a dreamer or a poet, but an exact scientist. Several of Edison's workers found that their clocks had stopped at exactly 3:24 a.m., the time of Edison's death. After his death, the plans for his apparatus could not be located. 10 years later, it was rumored that the great inventor had come through at a séance in New York. Irresacible as ever, Edison told the sitters that the plans for his machine were with three of his assistants, and that the machine should be built. His instructions were followed, and the plans duly located. The apparatus was constructed, but it remained silent. Edison's spirit materialized at another seance and suggested some technical changes. J. Gilbert Wright, the discoverer of putty and a member of the seance circle, made the changes and claimed to have contacted the spirit of genius inventor Charles Steinmetz, who suggested other improvements to the machine. Wright kept tinkering with the apparatus until his death in 1959, when the machine, like many ghostly phenomena, disappeared. Was Edison's energy indestructible? Have his swarms, in fact, survived? If the Wizard of Menlo Park has truly discovered a method of communicating with the living over there in that very beautiful place, he's keeping it to himself. Invisible visitors to the Edison Museum. On the other hand, something invisible seems to be communicating with visitors at Edison's birthplace museum in Milan. The curator writes, "This winter I took a family of 4 on a tour, and at the end the 4-year-old boy turned to his mother and said, 'Mother, do you hear the angel voices here?' Rather a strange comment from a boy that young. Angel voices. Or if Edison had gotten his apparatus working, some spirit communicating through the ether. Several summers ago, a young man on tour with me said angrily to me, 'What's going on here?' The hair was erect on his arms, and he was sure that there was a presence in this home. One lady with another guide said that she too sensed a presence in the house. But when she saw a picture of Edison's cousin, Miss Marietta Wadsworth, she decided that she was residing there. Miss Wadsworth was caretaker of the birthplace for Thomas Alva Edison for about 30 years, starting in 1914. The Last Trump. Direct voice communication with the dead was a common phenomenon in the seance room. Mediums who produced voices were often known as trumpet mediums, because the spirit voices manifested themselves through a tin trumpet. In 1913, the American Society for Psychological Research reported on a trumpet medium named Elizabeth Blake from Braddock in Lawrence County. Miss Blake could produce voices which apparently came from the spirit world by placing the wide ends of 2 aluminum cones together and listening at the narrow end. Dave Albert, an expert magician and exposer of fraudulent mediums, became interested in the case and persuaded James Halsep of the American Society for Psychological Research, who was also born in Ohio, to investigate. They visited Miss Blake, giving false names. She was crippled, elderly, and lived in a small rural town, so the investigators thought it unlikely that she would know who her visitors really were. After holding the trumpets, the medium told the other investigator, George Clausen, to listen at the opening. Faint whisperings began to be heard from the opening. The medium put one hand of the trumpet to her ear and told Clausen to put the other to his. The whispering went on. Clausen only caught a few of the words. Most were indistinct, a kind of hissing. The voice claimed to be Eddie, Clausen's dead brother. Clausen was puzzled by the messages, which were difficult to understand, and passed the trumpet to David Albert. The voice said in a loud whisper, "I am your brother, and I want to talk to Mother." "Tell her," the voice failed. Albert encouraged it to go on. "Tell her that I love her." Impatiently, Albert handed the trumpet back to Clausen, but the voice repeated, "I want to talk to my brother. I want to talk to my brother Davy. Brother Davy Albert." The investigators went away baffled, convinced that Miss Blake had actually produced the voices of the dead. Voices from Beyond. Electronic voice phenomenon, or EVPs, have long been a dream of many psychic researchers. In the 1960s, Konstantin Radviv, a psychologist interested in paranormal phenomenon, tried to tape record the voices of the dead. Radviv designed something he called a goinometer, which he believed received voices from beyond. The voices spoke in a mixture of foreign languages and static, and listeners had to be trained to analyze the highly amplified voices. Other researchers think that the voices were a mixture of radio transmissions and wishful thinking, with a few messages transmitted telekinetically from or through Radviv. Ohio scientist and inventor George Meek, born in Springfield, is also intrigued by radio communication with the dead. Working with an eccentric electronics wizard, Bill O'Neill, Meek believed that he had succeeded in establishing two-way radio communication with voices from beyond the grave. As told in The Ghost of 29 Megacycles, Bill O'Neill first noticed ghostly body parts materializing in a small aquarium he kept in the workshop. Some ghost hunters feel that water is an excellent transmitter of psychic vibrations. Then a former rocket scientist named Dr. Mueller materialized. He coached O'Neill, telling him that what frequencies to try, shades of Edison's idea that dead scientists would help with his apparatus. The burlesque Dr. Mueller was impatient when O'Neill wanted proof that he was who he said he was. When he finally gave O'Neill details of his life, all of them checked out. O'Neill and Meek held a press conference in Washington to announce that two-way radio communication with the dead had been achieved. This was over a decade ago. The rest is silence. Phone call from the dead. Diane, a woman from Akron. Diane, a woman from Akron, lost her favorite aunt in a car crash. She was devastated because she and her aunt were very close. We were like sisters. 6 months later, Diane received a phone call from the dead woman, but somehow it didn't seem any different than any other ordinary conversation. Until afterwards. They chatted, and as they had always done. We talked about different things we had done in the past, places we had been together, just sort of reminiscing. I was home alone, and this went on for about half an hour. When I hung up, I thought it was Lorraine. But she's dead. She was killed instantly in an automobile accident 6 or 7 months ago. I even get chills about it now, thinking about it, talking about it. In fact, I was so upset I dialed her number, but no one answered. And what if they had? Long distance. Susan Garwan of Middletown had an unearthly phone call the night her father was buried. For some reason, when a relative dies, I seem to be in tune with it. The night we buried my father, the phone rang and rang. It was very late and it woke me, but I finally got up and answered the phone, and I could hear my father's voice very clearly. "Juji," said her father's voice, using his pet name for her. "What am I doing here? What has happened?" In shock, she hung up. She was home alone, and the call startled her to death. She turned every light on in the house and immediately called a friend to come over and stay with her. Shaking, she thought about the conversation over and over. Had it been a hallucination? Was she going crazy? She had been certain it was her father's voice, and most chilling of all, where was her father calling from? Says Susan, it was a very bad connection. Like long, long distance.